Hi guys, it's Kate, and today I'm really excited to finally present my final project, Intercountry Adoption, Balancing the Familial, the National, and the Global. So essentially, ICA or intercountry adoption is the transfer of children from one country to parents of another. When we consider the countries that are involved in adoption, there are sending countries and receiving countries. But at the end of the day, all countries in the world have children in social care in need of homes. The difference then between sending and receiving countries is not the presence or absence of children, but the presence or absence of people who are willing to adopt those children and agencies that are willing to facilitate the transfer. In other words, the market of intercountry adoption is driven by domestic conditions in receiving countries, not domestic conditions in sending countries. We'll talk more about that later. Going back, international adoption is overseen mainly by the HCIA, or Hague Convention on Inter-Country Adoption. Um, the HCIA is based on two main principles, subsidiarity and best interests. However, to have an international legal standard or international moral standard inherently rests on certain value perspectives on welfare. The application of a certain value perspective is known as a social welfare model, of which there are three different types. Social welfare models are essentially different organizations and delegations of responsibility between the state and the public for responsibility towards welfare. Under neoliberal SWMs, responsibility for welfare is private. Under conservative corporatist, welfare is still privatized, but there's more of an emphasis on public responsibility. Under social democratic SWMs, welfare is public. Subsidiarity is a key principle in the HCIA and is essentially prioritization of the local. So it defines at what point is the responsibility of the state and eventually the international community to step in to take care of orphans. Under the HCIA, states which are following subsidiarity and following the HCIA should not allow ICA from non-HCIA compliant countries. There should also be specific regulations protecting the subsidiarity principle. The guiding question for this project is, how does the type of welfare regime in receiving countries inform their application or lack thereof of the subsidiarity principle? This study uses a large N neo-positivist study looking at the legislation of the 20 top receiving countries by number of children adopted in the last 10 years. The independent variable for this is social welfare model, which I developed my own equation for, which is measured by a W value, where W equals the percentage of private social expenditure divided by public social expenditure. Our dependent variable then is subsidiarity, which I've divided into soft and strong. All of the top 20 receiving countries in the world are Hague signatories, which means that they are required to have subsidiarity. However, as an international standard, the HCIA's definition of subsidiarity is relatively lenient. So if countries are able to meet that standard but not exceed it, we would consider them to have soft subsidiarity. Again, hard subsidiarity would necessitate that countries do not have partnerships with non-HCI compliant countries and that they do have specific regulations to protect subsidiarity. Analysis of subsidiarity will be done through a qualitative content analysis. We then hypothesized that states with neoliberal or conservative corporatist social welfare models will be more likely to employ soft subsidiarity than states with social democratic SWMs. A Fisher exact test will then be used to test for homogeneity between these two groups, and process tracing will then be used to try and better understand our results. This is more of a neo-positivist design, but I chose it because I wanted to be able to determine causality. I think, as a critical realist, I think that by having both these more qualitative and quantitative aspects, we can help bridge the nuance between causality and nuance. After conducting our test, we actually found that neoliberal was the most likely to have strong subsidiarity at 60%, or 3 out of 5. Conservative corporatist was 0%, while social democratic were 33%, was 4 out of 12. When taken as a whole, though, um, there's really not much of a difference between the different groups. We did the Fisher exact test and came up with a p-value of 0.2869, etc., which would then imply that there's no conclusive evidence of a causal link between subsidiarity and social welfare model. And then went back to try and figure out why these results occurred. And I think the problem is that one of our base assumptions was that ICA is driven by domestic conditions in the receiving countries. And while that is still supported by other studies that have occurred, when we look at subsidiarity, I think there are actually two different parts of it. There is one, choosing partner countries, which might be qualified as a domestic act, and then there's actually defining protecting subsidiarity, which may be perceived as more in the realm of global governance, i.e. the role of the Hague. Because when we look at Part 2 is what it actually counts as having strong subsidiarity. Countries have specific rules in place. But only 7 out of 20 of the cases that we looked at had this type of strong subsidiarity. But when we look at countries choosing the partners for ICA, we find that 12 out of 20 limited their partners to HCIA signatories or countries that could at least meet the same standards as The Hague. The question then is, why do some states, but not others, feel compelled to take part in the international side of subsidiarity? So it's not about social welfare model, which would be just like a domestic factor, nor is it about the size of the ICA program. When we look at the state that has the strictest rules about subsidiarity, it's actually the U.S., which has the largest ICA program. But the next two countries that have larger ICA programs, Spain and Italy, do not have um, strong subsidiarity. So the results here are still inconclusive. The study aimed to understand how ICA is leveraged politically and economically between sending and receiving countries according to application of the subsidiarity principle. However, we were not able to establish a causal link between social welfare model and subsidiarity. Through process tracing, we were able to create a new hypothesis which posits that application of subsidiarity is not wholly a domestic decision, but also an international one. We believe that states are more likely to take domestic actions in support of strong subsidiarity, i.e. choosing partners, but less likely to engage when they believe that subsidiarity is in the realm of international oversight, i.e. deciding how to define and enforce subsidiarity. This is a problem because the HCIA is meant to establish a standard, but not necessarily a goal. It's hoped with this type of international law that can be accessible to everyone while still maintaining the integrity of its principles. So there is that balance between accessibility and integrity, and it's hoped that states will take the initiative to do more on their own. More research, then, is needed to confirm whether there is a difference between international and domestic lines, and if so, why? Is this difference in implementation between partner states and subsidiarity because higher levels of subsidiarity require more domestic changes than choosing partners? If so, then how can we make international standards accessible while also maintaining their integrity and encouraging improvement? Beyond adoption, these questions deal with how the rights and responsibilities of individuals, nations, and international systems are weighed both ideologically and practically, and can have implications for other cases of global governance, such as immigration, terrorism, and climate change.